For we contend not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual host of wickedness in the heavenly places. From the American Midwest comes This Present Darkness, where we explore the supernatural aspects of the paranormal from a Catholic perspective and expose the dark forces in our world and beyond, both seen and unseen. Now, here's your host, historian, paranormal investigator, author, and ghost lorist, Ursula Bielski.
Back to the show. I'm Ursula Bielski. I'm so delighted to have our very, very special, very interesting, very knowledgeable guest with us today on the show. Just before that, I wanted to update you guys on our fundraiser to free our families in Pakistan from brick slavery. With your help, we have finally raised the first 1,100 of the $15,000 goal to free these families, and our first family has been freed. The Massif family went free today. They not only the whole family with the children and the grandparents are now free, but we also were able to give them a bunch of money and to buy food so that they could get on their feet while Shokat, the father, finds a good job and they get back on their feet. So thank you so much. I'm going to post a video all about the freeing of this awesome family, and hopefully that'll get you guys to give us more money so we can get to work on freeing another family. So thank you so much for that. God bless you. And without further ado, I want to introduce to you this very special guest we have tonight. He is a just fountain of knowledge and research about topics that we are all very interested in, and his name is Gary Wayne, and he's the author of a sort of Bible of its own, which we'll talk about, and it's called The Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I know a lot of you guys have read this book already. The subtitle is Our Secret How Secret Societies and the Descendants of Giants Plan to Enslave Humankind. Something a few years ago we all probably would have thought was completely insane, and now we know better. And we're going to talk all about that with our very special guest, Gary Wayne. Thanks so much for being here, Gary.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and very much looking forward to the conversation today. And I'll do a little bit of shameless self-promotion as well for people who like the first book, and for those out there who want to go a little deeper into the Bible on a real deep dive. I have another book that's coming out.
Deeper than 800 pages.
It'll be, it's only 84 chapters, but in terms of the biblical depth, it really goes deep for.
Fantastic.
And over the last number of years, since I published the first book, I had so much response to how much they liked the book, but they would have liked more information, just specifically what's in the Bible. So, and I said I would never write a sequel to the Genesis 6 Conspiracy because I had another book that I started. So, but it was so compelling that the thirst was so strong and I didn't realize that the knowledge was not that deep, and that churches all over did not teach prophecy and did not teach prehistory. And so people have all of these questions. So I wrote this book targeted towards Christians, specifically, as opposed to I was trying to reach into a whole bunch of different other groups and get people to understand the common history and the common destiny that we're on. This one here is to help arm the Christians. So it's called the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, How Understanding Prehistory and Giants helps to define end time prophecy. It will be released in October or November. And
this year.
So if people want this year, if people want to see the table of contents, it's on my timeline on Facebook, and I've been sort of posting it around. So it can be read independently of the first book, but I think each book will have one want to read the other book. So yeah, so it was a pleasure to write that book, and been spending most of my last couple of years as much time as I can to put into this book. So looking forward to getting it out. It's taking a little bit longer to get it out. The editing process with how deep the subject is was a little bit difficult. So we've gone through several editing processes, and the consistency now is just a matter of double checking the typesetting and then the final product. And so, yeah, it's getting close to coming out. And for people who, if they are familiar with me, or if they have read my first book and you're interested in the second book, you can get a hold of me at Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2 at gmail.com. That's with the number 2. And then on my website, you can get a hold of me as well at Genesis 6 Conspiracy at gmail.com. But if you want notification as to what the price will be, and when it will be released, and where it will be available, just send me a note. You don't have to say anything else. I will send you all of the information and let you choose what you want to do at that point in time.
That's great. It's funny. We talked just for a second before we started recording. Your wife is a Catholic and I'm a Catholic. And I was telling you that this show started out as a Catholic show, but after I had Tim Cohen on, now it's mostly an evangelical eschatological show. And it's funny, you know, I had something pop up in my feed the other day. It was from Reddit. It was a Catholic Reddit post. And someone said, does anybody know anything about these giants or Nephilim in Genesis? And everybody that answered, they were all Catholic, and they all said, they're mentioned like twice in the Bible. Are they important? You have a definite answer to that question. 800-page answer so far, plus the next book.
Yeah.
Can you tell any Catholics that are still my viewers, can you just sum up to us, what do you mean, what is it referred to when we hear Genesis 6 and the giants, the Nephilim?
Yeah, so let's just talk about that, understanding that giants are only mentioned a couple of times in the Bible. That's not quite true. They actually mentioned several more times, and also by different kinds of tribes. So it's one of those things where once you start to understand what's going on in prehistory, it starts to make some more sense. So most people are familiar with the word giant that's used in Genesis 6:4. And that goes back to the Hebrew word Nephil. And the I am that you see for Nephilim is the male plural. So it's like the giant ones or the tyrant ones. It's similar to a cherubim or a seraphim, and a seraphim would be a six-winged serpent angel, so a serpent angel ones. So the second time it's mentioned in the Bible is in Numbers 13:33, and it's mentioned twice there, where it says in the embellished part of the report of the scouts that Moses sent into the land of Canaan, the terrified scouts versus Joshua and Caleb, who were loyal and were absolutely accurate in their details, they embellish the term of what was described by Joshua and Caleb. And so they say the Anak are the children of giants. And that's the word Nephilim, and it goes back, it says that twice in Numbers 13:33. Those are only 3 times for Nephilim. Now, what's interesting is if we understand that there was 2 kinds of giants, Nephilim before the flood, Rephaim after the flood, things start to make a whole lot of sense. So the Anak, the Anakim, and Joshua and Caleb mentioned 3 Anakim kings in the report, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, and also people that are larger than the Israelites. I won't go down that rabbit hole at this point in time, but there are 2 classifications of people that are taller than the Israelites, and the Anakim are the giants that are being described. Well, the Anakim, or the Anakites as it might show up in most Bible translations, but you'll see Anakim as well in the King James Version. They're listed in Deuteronomy 2 with a lot of other giant nations. And it says like they were, Anakim were giants like the Emim and like the Zamzuzim and like the Horim and the Avim. And that word giant doesn't go back to Nephilim. It goes back to the Hebrew word Rapha, and that means the tribe of giants, 7497 in the lexicon. And these are the post-Diluvian giants. And so you have Rephaim mentioned as giant or listed specifically as Rephaim 25 times in the Old Testament in Hebrew. So a lot more than 2 or 3 times. And so when you see the valley of the Rephaim, or the valley of the giants, that goes back to the Hebrew word Rephaim. And it's mentioned several times, that valley in the Old Testament. And in Genesis 14, you actually get the tribe of the Rephaim listed. So you've got the root word that is sort of generic for giant, and then you have a tribe of giants, and they're listed in what people have no idea about because they're just not taught about the accurate details of it. In
We
Genesis
just hear
14,
the names
you have
rattled
a war.
off. We just hear the
You
names
have a war
rattled
of
off. I'm like,
giants.
oh, that's some tribes of people. And we have no idea
Yeah.
what we're actually hearing.
Yeah, and this in Genesis 14, this is the war of giants. So you have 4 kings against 5, 4 Mesopotamian giant kings warring against the giant nations of the covenant land, who are protecting the Canaanite pentapolis of Sodom, Gomorrah, and the cities of the plain. And they're going to reinstate their vassalhood on the Canaanite pentapolis. And so there's this war that's going to take place. And it's probably the largest war since the flood, might be one of the largest wars fought, but it's a war essentially of giants and hybrid giants that is fought in Genesis 14. We see that same tribe show up again when that tribe is in the Mount Hermon region, which starts to connect even some more dots if you're familiar with the creation of giants and the oath sworn Haram anathema on Mount Hermon. But in Genesis 15, in the land that is being promised to Abraham, you have what I call the mighty 10 nations versus the mighty 7 that you'll see in the time of the Exodus as they're listed. And the mighty 10 includes the Rephaim as part of the land from the Nile to the Euphrates that's being promised to Abraham for his descendants. And you also get several other names like the triple K that I call them, the Cadmonim, the Kenazim, and the Kenim that, again, just sort of come out of nowhere, along with the mighty 7 that are listed below. So you have 10 nations there that are essentially giant nations and hybrids that are occupying the land. And that's just kind of like the introduction to all the things that are written about giants in the Bible. And so, with tribes like the Anakim, they're listed many, many times in the Bible. Same with the Avim, same with the Horim. And so it's just a matter of identifying who these nations are. And the nations that are giant nations, they don't have a patriarch listed in the Table of Nations. So when I talk about the Table of Nations, that's the 70 nations that are listed as patriarchs in Genesis 10 after the flood and in First Chronicles 1. So Noah has descendants and then there's patriarchs and they all start these nations, and we get that for the 70 nations if you do the total up. And there's the same number of nations that were before the flood that's ruled over by the council of the gods, the rebellious fallen angels that are described in Deuteronomy 32. And it's the same number as the sons of Adam, even though we don't get all 70 sons listed, but Adam had 70 sons, according to Deuteronomy 32, that made up the nations before the flood. So all of this becomes very much interconnected with biblical history, giants, and fallen angels. And it's the larger context to understand the whole Bible. And if you want to understand why everything happens in the Bible, you have to understand the angelic rebellion. You have to understand the revenges as to why Adam was created, why they took revenge against Adam, why they created the giants, and how this resolution comes to a conclusion in the end time.
I think a lot of people like myself, especially a lot of Catholics, I think first started learning about the angels mating with humans in Genesis through the work of the now late Michael Heiser. And that's how I did. I was doing UFO research actually a couple of years ago when I came across him talking about UFOs, and then got into his lectures and his books and things. And it's crazy. And so many people say about his work that it, as yours does, it connects all those dots and answers all those questions where you feel there's none of this stuff is related to each other. And then all of a sudden it all makes sense when you realize what's actually going on that has never really been addressed, especially for the great majority of us. You said you had I know I had a moment like this, and there are so many people these days that say like they feel like they're being called to tell what's going on and tell the truth, and so many people have a mission. I feel that way. It seems like everybody can trace that back to when they were younger, but it's coming to fruition now. For me, it was, I don't know have you ever heard, your wife ever talk about the Garabandal apparitions that happened in Spain in the early 1960s?
Not those ones, no.
Yeah,
But
they're
I'm quite
lesser known than like Fatima and Lourdes, but it was
yeah,
4 little girls in Spain who have these apparitions, and there were prophecies involved too. And many people believe that this synod that's been going on in the church, that's going to be, with all this research that's been going on that Francis has been doing, plotting, whatever, and it's all going to be unveiled in October. And many people believe that this is the beginning of the rolling out of the Garabandal prophecies. But when I was a little girl, my godmother took me up to Wisconsin to a lecture about the Garabandal apparitions, and it's always been with me throughout, as I've grown up and through everything that I've done. And so I feel like that really kind of set me up to be a part of all this stuff that's happening. And you had an event like that in your life where you read a book and that kind of set you thinking.
it was kind
Can
of
you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. And just before I get into that, one of the things that members of my family that I married into were very much taking acknowledgement of would be the Medjugorje apparitions.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the ones that the Vatican and Pope Francis has accepted most of those events as being accurate. And they have 3 children that were initiated, or 6 children that were initiated into these prophecies that will come out. And there's 10 major prophecies that were set down on specific dates. So all the Marian apparitions, and there's many of them, not just the major ones at Lourdes and Fatima that people are familiar with, but ones all over the world, like Guadalupe from hundreds of years ago. Right. Ignatius of Loyola starts off on his mission to change the Catholic Church after being initiated with the Mary apparitions. And Joan of Arc is a Mary apparition, and it has a long history of these apparitions and this common sort of prophetic destiny to convert the world to one religion for the end time. And so I just wanted to sort of throw that out. And I do talk about the Medjugorje one in the first book, and then I talk about some more of the apparitions in the second book as well, just so to give people a larger sort of flavor on it, to keep an eye on that, because there's a definite connection in there for the fig tree generation. And if people aren't familiar with the fig tree generation, that's the generation that Jesus described as the last generation. Mm-hmm. So, and that would be part of the fig tree generation, Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 17 and 21. So what got me rolling in this whole area was I was a very young person, and I was with my brother and a friend on a Friday night, and we're having some beers, and late into the night, they start talking about Antichrist and false prophet and really kind of crazy sort of stuff. And then they said to me, how much courage do you have? And I said, oh, I have a lot of courage. I'm young. I'm basically not really afraid of anything. And they said, well, I have a book for you to read if you have the courage. But if you don't read it. And I said, oh, I'll take the challenge on. And I said, what's the name of the book? And it was a book by Hal Lindsey called The Late Great Planet Earth. And he was way ahead of his time. And he wrote a lot of books in the 60s and the 70s and early 80s. I think this was his most famous book.
I believe, the best-selling book of the 1970s, nonfiction book of the 1970s.
Yeah. Yeah. So it was widely read. And I wanted to verify whether or not he was being accurate. And so it's easy just to pull out a Bible and you look up some verses. But as we all know, there's a lot of people who seem to be using the Bible, but are manipulating it.
Yes.
And for their own specific ends and their own specific rewards. So this book literally scared the socks off of me. So I wanted to know whether or not I need to pay attention to this more. And the only way I could do that is to try and verify it. So that means I have to start reading the Bible again. And so, I read the Bible the first time, and then I realized, there's just too much in there to remember. I didn't have a plan to how I was going to connect it. So I thought maybe I'll go through the Bible and I'll just start tracking all the different prophecy narratives. And I thought, I'll just use some highlighters. And then, of course, you run out of highlighters very quickly because, about a third of the Bible is prophetic. So, and there's a lot of different trails that run through it, which is, again, another crazy reason why churches don't teach about prophecy when there's so much in there about prophecy. And the context for the prophecy also comes out of prehistory. So I started to write everything down into different files, and I had to restart that several times. But as I was going through, and the first time of saying I'm going to highlight and log, I got into Genesis 6, and I saw the word giant. And I'm going, I don't know what that's all about, and I don't want anything to do with that. That's not what I'm here to do. It's just not,
Right.
No way. That's too crazy. And it's really kind of silly when I was thinking that way, but I wasn't yet sort of open to the idea that the Bible is the most preternatural book ever written and ever will be written in our church history. So you have these giants that just don't remain in this one little verse of 4 verses. That's the preamble to the flood story. You have giants that show up after the flood, and we're not even told how they show up after the flood.
Yeah, how did that
And
happen?
Yeah. And so I'll come back to that. So all of that got me on this track. And by the time I had everything logged on the prophecy, I thought, and I had gone back and logged through the giant passages, I thought I would see whether I could write a book, and a short book. And I thought, I need to find out, can I write a book? Can I get it published? Will people read it? Will it sell? So I thought I would write a short book about connecting the giants of Genesis 6 to the angels and the demons that show up in the book of Revelation. And so I wrote that fairly quickly, but it started me down a road where once I realized that, and I knew right, early on that on the research that because I was a history buff and a mythology buff, that these giants are talked about in all cultures around the world. And they're talking about the same events just through, just through a polytheist lens. So I decided,
all the
well,
ancient myths and everything, that we grew up reading, the Greek myths and the Roman myths. And
so if people don't realize that, and I'll just give one quick example on it. So in Greek mythology, in Atlantis, you have Poseidon, who's the god of Atlantis, part of the Olympian gods. And he's going to marry Clydo, a human female, and produce 10 demigod giant kings that are going to rule over the Atlantean Empire. And those 10 kings is the same number that shows up in end time prophecy. It's the 10
just
kings.
like in the Bible.
Just like in the Bible. And 10 is one of those standard sort of numbers, but it has a whole bunch of information that we can understand if we understand that nothing is new under the sun, and what was will be again. And Atlantis was considered the golden civilization and the helm of world government, trying to set up a globalist community before the flood, and are part of the destruction in the flood story, as it's destroyed by a cataclysm of events, including a flood. similar to what's described in the Bible. So it's the same story. It's just through a polytheist lens. As to what Genesis 6 is talking about in the introduction and the reasons for the flood story. And so once I just added that, and then I realized that people would need a little bit of context about the religion and the culture, because it was all sort of interwedded. And so then I decided, well, okay, then I have to read about all of these different religions and put some of that in so I can intelligently talk about why they were so compliant and why they were doing the things that they were doing. And then I realized that through the religions developed the mystery schools. And the mystery schools were the origin to the secret societies. So then I had to learn all about secret societies. And I went down that rabbit hole for about 10 years trying to figure that out. And I realized that they take their history back to the same sources in Genesis. And so by the time I started writing the first book, it was like 1995, and the book didn't publish till about 2016. So
that's a lot of research.
And it turned into 98 chapters and not a short book. So now you're asking the question about how did giants show up after the flood? Because we're not given a smoking gun passage like we are in Genesis 6:4. And so I think we have to be careful on that, because we're not told exactly how. So typically I have my favorite position, and I'll mention that. But typically there are three main buckets that people put it into. And the first bucket, which is my least favorite, is somehow on the ark. And that is through, some people say, through the genes of the wives that were interbred with the giants and that married the sons of Noah. That's how they show up. And then they show up in the Canaanite bloodlines. And I think that's, you can't rule it out. It's not my least favorite. I just think that God was choosing people that were not only pure in spirit, but pure physically as well to restart. And that if you're going to have 4 races after the flood, you're going to have to understand how that could happen. And it seems to me that it's a bit of a reach to have the 4 races and the giant gene in there in terms of how that would happen. But it makes sense to me that the wives could be from each of the races of the 3 sons, and you have the race of Noah and his wife. So that would make a little bit more sense to me. And also on the ark is that Gnostics will say that Tubal Cain survived, just as they showed him in the last Noah movie that Hollywood put out. That's a Gnostic doctrine. Or some people say in Jewish mysticism, King Og was a stowaway on the ark because he's the last of the giants, or last of the Rephaim. And some of the Gnostics say, well, Ham was a giant, and some of the Gnostics say all 3 sons were giants, and some of the Gnostics say everybody was a giant on the flood, on the ark. So that's the first bucket, and that's my least favorite. It's the second one is a little bit more plausible.
Wait, hold on. People say Noah was a giant?
Oh yeah, It's
I
as
never
you get,
heard
and
that.
even on the Christian sort of side of it, they'll say the environment was completely different than what it is today, which allowed everything to grow bigger, including humans. And so Noah was a giant like everybody else. What I try and explain to Christians is if that was the case, and I'm not convinced that that was the case, is the giants that were created from the angels would still be even bigger than that. So you, relatively speaking, you still have that disparity of size.
Right. Okay.
And that's a significant disparity of size. But the Gnostics, you'll start to understand where the Gnostics are coming from with their belief that all of them were giants when you understand that around the world, and this is the second bucket, there's survival stories of the flood. And the flood shows up in all continents, all over the world, in over 500 cultures of ancient cultures. And who knows what we'll find in Antarctica, but I can't include Antarctica yet, but who knows what we might find there. And in those stories, you get human survival stories and you get giant survival stories. And so the classic one would be the Epic of Gilgamesh. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you have Gilgamesh, who's 2/3 god and 1/3 human. And he is the offspring of Lugabanda, king of Uruk, and Nin, a fertility goddess. And so he is on a quest, and Enkidu is created the same way to offset Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh goes on a quest to find a fellow by the name of Zudra or Upnapishtim, depending on which translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh that you're reading. And he is, and that is the Mesopotamian Noah, as they like to call him. And that's the classic 7-day flood story from the polytheist version. And Upnapishtim is also 2/3 god, 1/3 human. He's a demigod, created in the same way Gilgamesh is created, and his whole family are demigods. They're all 2/3 god and 1/3 human. So it's a giant survival story that everybody says is the same as the Noah story, and it's not. It's the same macro accounting of the same event, but it's not talking about human survival. It's talking about the archetypical giant selected to repopulate giants after the flood. And then in the Greek mythology, you have in history, you have Deucalion and Pyrrha, also called the Greek Noah. And Deucalion is the son of Prometheus, and Prometheus is a fallen angel. So this is another giant story. So this bucket here is with the help of angels. So in the flood story, you would see these stoned angels that are chained. They're helping to build the ark. And just as in the book of Enoch, which I think is a corruption, it says in the Giaz version that the angels built the ark for Noah, which the Bible doesn't say. So it says that Noah built the ark and his family. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in all these other ones with giant survival stories, it's the gods who provide the ark for these giants. And so this bucket's called with the help somehow of fallen angels. And that God obviously knew they were going to do that because he's Alpha Omega, but he was looking to do a restart so that all the names that were written in the book of life had a chance to live on the earth and keep their name in the book of life or have it blotted out based on what they choose while they're here. And so it was to buy more time. And so this is somehow being saved by the angels, either on an ark, in the planet, as some people will say, off the earth somehow, in another dimension, somehow with the help of these angels. And biblically, you could get there saying that that's possible, but you have to be a little bit legalistic to make it fit with the details, because typically we're told only the 8 survived, right? That's how people would understand the story. But it also says that God was going to destroy everything that he created. And he didn't create the giants. So it says that in Genesis 6, and it says that in Genesis 7. And so you could make a legal argument that he was only starting anew and purified with what he created. So each of the animals that were called to the ark would be a pure representative of that wasn't corrupted by the technology and the hegemony of the giants and the fallen angels as ruling over the earth and their corruption of the whole earth. And then when it says the whole earth was corrupt, that's the Hebrew word shakath, means decay, ruin, pervert, destroy. And so and that includes the plant genome and the DNA of humans and animals as well. So that's the second bucket. My preferred bucket, which you don't have to do these legal sort of machinations, but you have to be open because, again, we don't have the smoking converse. I think the best fit is second incursion, or a second creation of giants after the flood. And so
they're still messing around.
Yeah, and then they were kind of stopped. And if you look at what happens in prehistory, you have parent gods and offspring gods. So Kronos and Gaia would be the 2 main for the parent gods before the flood. After the flood, it's Zeus and the Olympians, and they're called offspring gods. And you have that same scenario all around the world. So you have El as the patriarchal god and parent god of Canaan before the flood, but then Baal and the Baalim take over after the flood. And what's interesting about that, in Osiris and Isis are offspring gods, and Anki and Enlil are offspring gods in Mesopotamia, and Anu and Tiamat and gods and goddesses like that were the parent gods. And those parent gods, I think, are sent to the abyss prison for those crimes at the time of the flood. But those who didn't commit those crimes didn't go to the abyss. And so you're going to have in this army of rebellious angels of rank and order, you're going to have angels that are going to move up and take over. So the offspring gods take over in all of the cultures all around the world. And I think they produced giants after the flood. And that those angels who did the same crimes as what happened before the flood will also be sent to the abyss prison or the pit prison. And so they disappear. And so in the Ugaritic texts, you have rituals to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth to recreate more of the Rapiu, which is a Semitic RPM, which is the root word for Raphaim after the flood. And they have an assembly of the Datanu, the assembly of the Raphaim kings that are answering to the council of the gods at Mount Hermon in the Ugaritic texts. And these are the giants that ruled after the flood. And that one of Baal's names is, he has many names, and there's different ways of spelling this, but it would be Raphael, whether or not it is like Raphael out of the Apocrypha of the King James, or a counterfeit name, and it would be IEL or like that, as some of the occult would do the spelling, but seems to be the name that would have been sort of patronymic and then passed on eponymously as the name of the Rephaim tribes. And so they take what's really important to understand is they take their creation back to the Baalim. So not just Baal and Ashtaroth, but some of the other Baalim gods as well.
This doesn't have anything to do with the great saint, Archangel Raphael, I hope.
Well, the thing you need to remember is that the rebellious angels counterfeit everything. And so that's why I was careful to say that would be not the Raphael that would be included in the Apocrypha. It would be another name, and Baal would be one of the names, but they would have other titles and things like that. And one of the reasons that he would have that name is he would have passed on a specific trait to the Rephaim, and that they had this healing capability.
Yes.
So Raphael, as you would look at the loyal angel, or the angel that's mentioned also in the book of Enoch as being part of the seven archangels, that actually means healer of God in Hebrew.
Yeah, he's the great healer.
The word, so 7495 in the lexicon of Hebrew for the Strong's Concordance means healer or medicine and things like that. And it's the root word for 7497, which means giant, and the root word for 7496, which means a demon spirit or an evil spirit or the disembodied spirit of the Rephaim. So all three are interconnected and have gives you the more, let's say, the larger size of the meaning by taking all three into account. And what's interesting again in the Ugaritic text is that these Rapium, RPM is the original Semitic, they were called the healers and the saviors. And so they're Antichrist type figures and they're healers, and that they could not only heal themselves, but they could heal others. And hence part of the name. So typically when you see secular scholars or polytheist scholars translating that, they don't use the name giant there, they'll use the name healer, but they're all interrelated. That's the source word for the words that provide for the disembodied spirit of the giants after they die, or the giant tribe. And so you have this understanding that there's this passing on of these traits that came from their sort of celestial mafia, the Godfathers, right? After the flood.
Yeah.
And so for me, a second incursion fits better with what we can line up biblically, because we get Rephaim used 25 times in Hebrew in the Old Testament. And then we get all these other tribes that are depicted as Rephaim-like or branch tribes that show up after the flood. And all of a sudden, it starts to make a whole lot of sense. We get the Baalim in the Bible as well. So you can use the Ugaritic text and match that up biblically, and it matches perfectly, but through a polytheist lens. It's describing the same set of events, and it's describing the same types of beings and individuals. And Ugarit is the city that's between Mount Hermon and Tyr. In Arit, it's a Arit is a compound word. Arit means terrible, and translated as terrible ones in the King James Version Bible. So when you're reading in Ezekiel 32, you have Pharaoh, who is one of these terrible ones, and he's a Rephaim king, is being spoken to by the terrible ones, have been locked into the sides of the pit prison. And these were the terrible ones who were kings like him. And then they'll list all of these other famous ones later as you go through Ezekiel 32. And they were slain for doing, they were slain and did terrible things while they were on the earth. And the implication is terrible things to humankind. And for that, when they died, they were sent to the pit prison. And so Arit is that same word that's used in Ugarit from the Semitic language. And Ug is the shortened version of Og, which is OWG, rooted in UWG, which means round or wide or stout. And understand that the Rephaim and the giants were considered stout, very wide, like a 2-to-1 height to width ratio versus a 3-to-1. So they were, and they weren't fat, they were muscular. So they were giant in height and width. And that means Og, the terrible one, the city. So it would be called in Hebrew, Kiriath Ugarit. Or you could go as the terrible one. If it was plural, you wanted to be just as they were terrible ones as in other giants, you would be Kiriath Ugaritim. So you have, again, the Hebrew language lining up perfectly with this, because the Hebrew comes out of the Semitic languages, lines up perfectly with what we know in the Bible. And King Og, he moves over to Mount Hermon as a Rephaim king after the war in Genesis 14, where you have most of the Rephaim of the Mount Hermon region wiped out by those 4 kings from Mesopotamia. And by the time of the Exodus, King Og is going to be the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants, as he's described, ruling over the Amorites, who are a hybrid group of beings from the Canaanite tribes. And he's the one that is going to be killed by Moses and Joshua in the Eastern campaign before they cross over into the Jordan River, and again classified as the last Rephaim. So the remnant of the giants. So you can say, you could make a case with that he would be a survivor, as in Jewish mysticism, on the ark. You could say that he is the last of the giants before the flood somehow, some way, or he's the last of the second recreation of the giants after the flood, because he's not called Nephilim as the last of the giants. That tells me he's a post-diluvian giant, because Nephilim only shows up in the Bible before the flood.
I know everybody wants to know, is any of this bloodline still going today? Are there descendants of these beings still today?
Yeah, so I think there are. So when we understand there are giants before the flood and there's giants after the flood, and if they're a distinct kind of giant after the flood, as saying smaller and not as powerful or as many gifts as the Nephilim. And then we understand that term terrible one, eretim. Part of that definition in Hebrew is childless and infertile. And so as you read through some of the accountings, it's not that I think it's technically infertility that it's referring to, although it could possibly be that, or both to the second part of it. I think as we read through the accountings is they had trouble reproducing women. There's very, very few women, and that accounts of, from this period shows that
Yeah, I guess
they were having
so.
trouble reproducing because not
Now that
enough
you
women were
mention
being
it.
produced.
Mhm.
Yeah. And we do get, and people say, well, there's not even any women mentioned in the Bible that were giants. So there's
Yeah.
one for sure. I would suggest Makkah would be another one, but you have Timnah, which is the daughter of Seir in Genesis 36, in the Dukes of Edom. And
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
and Horim is a giant tribe, and she marries Eliphaz, son of Esau, brother of Jacob. And they produce the hybrid Amalekite. So you have, and they used purebred females to start new dynasties. So we do get one name for sure, and I think Makkah, and Makkah could also be a male name from the Makkah-themed giants of the Mount Hermon region. There was both matronymic and patronymic. So both females and males were named after the same individual. So this fertility issue led to a decision that these giants had to make. And they were either going to become extinct or they were going to find a way to reproduce. And the only way they could do that is with humans. So after the flood, I think very shortly on, and certainly by the time after Babel, when the Canaanites have resettled into the land, and you have all of these Rephaim nations who are the aboriginal peoples, as they're described in ancient Hebrew, as they define these nations. And so they're going to intermarry with them, but it's the daughters that are going to initially intermarry with Canaan and possibly Heth and Sidon, which are the two sons of Canaan. And they then produce 9 what I call patriarchless tribes in the Table of Nations. Out of the 70 patriarchs that are listed, 9 are not listed. And those 9 are like the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Archites, the Hivites, and the whole list of the 9. And Rephaim patriarchs were not listed in the Bible. So you don't have Rapha as a patriarch. And you don't have, even though we don't have Rapha show up as a specific name, it's defined as either a tribe of giants or a name of a giant. And there's people that are named as giants and possibly the eponymous name as it's defined. But one is named for sure, and that fellow is named Arba. And Arba is talked about in the book of Joshua in the time of the Exodus, and he is the most famous of the Anakim and the patriarch of the Anakim. And his name isn't listed in the Table of Nations either, just as Makkah isn't listed. And there's many names of tribes that show up after the flood that don't show up in the Table of Nations because they have Rephaim patriarchs. So what happens is the daughters of Canaan, and perhaps Seth and Heth and Sidon intermarry with the Rephaim, and you produce these 9 patriarchless nations. And so the Anakim are shown on reliefs and records as being blonde hair, pale skin, and blue eye. And so are the Amorites. So the Amorites seem to have been a product of an Anakim giant, and probably somebody named very similar to Amor or Hamor, as the equivalent spelling is for one of the kings at Shechem. So it's probably
Okay.
Emoriy, as we would transliterate that as being the patriarch for the Amorites. And again, in the second book, I trace all of this back. When I go deep into the Bible for Christians, this is how deep I go into the second book. And I take all of those patriarchless nations back to a specific patriarch. And I also will link the names of these pureblood Rephaim tribes and take them back to a specific patriarch as well. And you can do that patronymically, eponymically, and patriarchally. So through tribes names, through patriarch title names, and through the names of places. Because typically all of these kings were named after famous kings and things like that, famous people. So back to the original part, after explaining that, I just didn't think I could leave that sort of unclarified. You have this intermarriage that it's now going to create the dynasties. So Nimrod in the occult is thought to create dynastic bloodlines with the giants, and he's going to intermarry with the Elamites, which means Olam, ancient from the east as a people, and again, no patriarch. For the ones that the Elamites that are named in the Bible that intermarry with. There's two groups of people as you take that back into history there, and so the Elamites are the Aboriginals, and Nimrod creates, bloodlines through into some of the Mesopotamian dynasties. So like the Babylonians and the Akkadians and the Assyrians will all come down through Nimrod and that hybrid bloodline. You have that bloodline of the Amalekites that creates the Dukes, which is the Aleph is the Hebrew word, and the Catholic Encyclopedia calls these the Alephim. It's like a hybrid set of kings, and that's understood as the fairy kings or the elven kings or the elves, as it comes down through
I was going to ask you about
culture.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, and these are the royales of these hybrid bloodlines that are surviving, and they took over all of the kingships around the world. And so the word royale is, basically goes back as ROI into Old French and EL. And then as you go further back, it'll go back to ruler into Indo-Aryan. But that name Wa means ruler or king. And the AL that it's transliterated as, it comes from EL, which is a word in Hebrew for a god. So they call themselves the kings of God, or Rex Deus is another, and Rex Deus, as some people pronounce it, is another term meaning kings of God, and it's that royal bloodline. And in the Middle East, you have several transliterations of EL. So it'll show up in Mesopotamia like as ILU, for example, or IL, or it could show up as AL, as in Baal, as it's shown in the Bible. It's the same word, it's just a different transliteration. And so, yeah, so the technical, people don't really connect this, but, the Masons will say, like Baal is their god as an allegory for Satan and Lucifer, and they translate that as Lord God, same as Lord God is used in the Bible, which I think shouldn't be translated that way for obvious reasons, just as Lucifer shouldn't be in there as well, because that's the god of the Masons as well, should be Halel, as it was directly described in Hebrew. But if we understand that they believe they have a bloodline dynasty that comes from the Baalim after the flood for their divine right to rule, the whole nobility elite are bloodlines that go back to the giants and specific fallen angels, and they keep their genealogies. And where they fit in the hierarchy of the royales is how pure those bloodlines are. And another factor is how they are ennobled, or a scioning in of another ennobled bloodlines back to different fallen angels and back to different patriarchal Rephaim can enhance that position. So you shouldn't be surprised if somebody like King Charles III says he has his genealogies, and part of that genealogy goes back to Vlad the Impaler.
Right.
And Vlad the Impaler was part of Ordo Draconis and the Sarkani Rond, and part of trying to put those polytheist kings back on the throne that they were being pushed back on in Europe. And that they take their bloodlines back to Hercules and the Agrathi tribe of Greece, or Scythia, and Scythians were giants. It was part of the 4 Indo-Aryan groups after the flood. And Hercules is the son of Zeus and Alchemy, a human female. And they keep these genealogies.
Isn't it amazing how it's still called the Enlightenment after it's like completely wiped away all the truth about everything?
Yeah.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back and we're going to hear all about how this connects to secret societies, including the Freemasons, of course. So come right back here in just 1 minute. See you then. Welcome back. We're here with Gary Wayne talking about all the weird stuff, as Dr. Heiser used to call it. And we just started talking briefly a minute ago about how the rulers of the modern world proudly trace their roots to these giant clans. And we did a whole show, 3-hour show a few months back with Tim Cohen, author of The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, and his theory that none other than the new King Charles is the Antichrist. What's your take on that?
Well, I think one would have to consider him in the mix if we're in the fig tree generation. And I think we are in that fig tree generation. His age would play against that. But his son William might be a better fit. They certainly have a very ennobled bloodline. And for people who aren't familiar with the Windsors, they actually changed their name to Windsor in World War I. They're the Hanovers through Germany, and that's how he takes his genealogy back through the intermarriage of all the royals, back to Vlad the Impaler. And he also has the unicorn on his coat of arms, just as the Stuarts had the unicorns, and the Hanovers have a doubled unicorn. And you have unicorn mixed with the Antichrist, right, in the King James Version Bible. It shouldn't be translated in there as unicorn. It should be wild bull, but they've put it in there. And I think that was to sort of enhance the imagery of the mighty Prince James. Gibor would be the Hebrew word for mighty there, as in Gibborim was a term used to describe the royals and the giants. And that that bloodline will have a claim to try and take control of the world. And King James starts that whole thing off with the expansion of the Commonwealth that begins with Elizabeth, right? And but he takes over the throne in 1601. So they're a strong candidate, and we can't ignore them. But there are many candidates, and we don't want to be pointing our fingers at any one individual, lest we be wrong when we lose our credibility. So Jesus told us that there would be many antichrists.
Yes.
And we're also told this in the epistles of John. So there's going to be counterfeit antichrist, if I could put that, because there can only be one that's going to be crowned in the temple. So we have to be very, very careful of this. And Antichrist is going to need one who seems like the true Antichrist if he's going to counterfeit everything Jesus does, right? Because Jesus comes back and defeats Antichrist. So he has to do the same thing. So another reason we want to be careful of that, in the West, there are, and I'll explain why I say in the West in a minute or two, there are other claims that are equal, or they would believe even stronger than the Windsor claim to the Antichrist title. And there's a family called the Anjou, who go back to the Vere. And the Anjou is the senior house to the Plantagenet.
Okay.
That many of the presidents take their bloodlines back to, and is also intermixed into the English bloodlines, but there's a lot of king changes, but that's in the time of King Richard, King John, the time of the Magna Carta, when the Plantagenets are ruling, and then you have the Tudors or take over, and then you have the Stuarts take over. But again, they will interwed that back in, but it's how strong those bloodlines are for that connection back to what the Anjou would claim would be their right, is where I'm going with that. And even though Queen Elizabeth had a major seat at the Golden Fleece Order of the Anjou, it's still the Anjou order, but she was there because of the noble bloodlines, and King Charles would be sitting on that Order of the Golden Fleece as well. So again, keep them in mind. But the Anjou have three sort of splits into the family that all make claims to what they call the King of Jerusalem title.
Wow.
And that they will want to be crowned and recognized as this King of Jerusalem when they come to power. So I'm not saying they're going to be the I'm just saying this is their stake and their claim, and how they have the King of Jerusalem title is through the Knights Templar, who are not poor knights. There are two Cistercians, but the Cistercians are bloodlines as well, and they're Gnostics molded within the monastic orders of the Catholic Church. The other are all Royals. And so de Bouillon, de Paon, and Anjou, who are original founders of the Knights Templar, take their bloodlines back to the last survivor of the Merovingians. It was Dagobert.
Mm-hmm.
And the Merovingians graft their lines back to pure line of descendancy, as they would say, back to fallen angels and Rephaim. And so now in 1118, Baldwin II, Anjou, is crowned King of Jerusalem in a small priory on the rock of Mount Zion. And then that is the title that comes down through all of the different kings of Jerusalem until 1188, after they're overthrown. But that title continues. But in this mix, you have a bunch of intrigue, and it's going to split into three different bloodlines that are making a claim. So you have the current title held by King Philippe of Spain, son of Juan Carlos, who inherited from the Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty. And he is recognized as the King of Jerusalem, and his family name is Bourbon, but they've been intermarried into the Anjou. And that Habsburg-Lorraine dynasties inherited the King of Jerusalem title through the House of Lorraine in France, where Anjou of the Templar, de Paon, and de Bouillon lived. And there's a bit of a route how it goes from Hungary back over into Lorraine, and then intermarriage with the Habsburgs, where that title continues to pass on. So von Habsburg doesn't recognize any who's living today, who's the heir to the Habsburg dynasty, doesn't recognize King Philippe as the legitimate ruler. He does. He makes a claim. And then there's the Naples Anjou, who ruled Italy, who also make that claim. And they all have this intermarriage claim that goes right back through those kings of Jerusalem in the time of the Templars that were ruling Jerusalem. And so there's a rivalry going on there who thinks that they should have a rightful title. Within that belief system and outside the Windsor bloodline, so within the French side of this and the Lorraine side of it and the passing on, there is this sort of mythos that they have, is that the grand monarch, as they will call him, will enter into the world and make his announcement through this hall, this archway at Geezer's castle in Geezer town, which is an important town to them, and then will be crowned in Jerusalem with this King of Jerusalem title. Now, there are other bloodlines who will make this claim as well, and they're around the world. So you'll have Antichrist figures showing up all over the place, and we have to be careful not to be too sort of biased to our Western influence or English influence, because this is a global thing that is going on. And so this is a normal thing that goes on in the bloodline families, this rivalry. So, for example, the Western bloodlines created something called social masonry, and that begat communism and socialism for the doctrine. And they launched that on the junior family to the Putyanin in Russia, who were considered themselves a higher bloodline than the Anjou and the Western bloodlines. That's an internal dispute, but they weren't on the same page. And so you had the Romanovs, who took over from the Putyanin through intermarriage in about 1600. That whole bloodline was wiped out. But the Putyanin were the original czars that started in Kiev. And you see Putin, whose name comes out of nowhere, in about 1850 with his grandfather or great-grandfather, depending on which historian. And what was written about in the Russian newspapers was he was an illegitimate son of an outside marriage or an outside copulation, and that in that tradition, they wouldn't give the full name, but they would give part of the name. And then his father moved to St. Petersburg just before World War I, which is how he arrives in Russia. And so he is wanting to reclaim the Kievan mythos and the bloodline and the empire. And you'll see that he has like the double eagle in his representation and his heraldry. He has Vladimir the Great, who started the branch bloodline czars of Russia and Moscow. And Vladimir was a Putyanin, and that he will take back that empire, but Kiev's his holy city, so he's not going to destroy Kiev, but he'll make a claim. And what's really interesting is that you have in Ezekiel 38 and 39, in the last days and before the second Exodus, so and before the midpoint of the last 7 years, you have this Gog war, and it's Gog, chief prince of Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, as it shows up. Meshech is the etymological root, as we would understand it, for Moscow. And if he has that sort of mythos and history, and he's also initiated into the Masonic organizations as well, you would have a scenario where you have a bloodline that is going to be an Antichrist type figure, because Gog, as you take that back to Hebrew, means an end time Antichrist type figure. But Gog doesn't show up in the Table of Nations anywhere. Magog does. And it's thought that Magog's name isn't the original name, and it was probably rewritten by writers, or he accepted the name, and he's the son of Japheth, from a giant name or a giant tribe. And so in Greek mythology, a god who was the parent god of Poseidon had several giant offspring, spirits offspring, and their names were Gog, Magog, and Albion. And so now you have this name that shows up. Gog, that isn't in the Table of Nations, is antediluvian, not post-diluvian, and Magog as well. And you see the sort of connections of names being passed on and people being named after giants after the flood. But the abyss has been opened at this point in time as well. And those terrible ones have come out of the abyss. So one wonders as to the connections to Gog and Antichrist with that war. And then you have, moving on, you have another bloodline that's reappearing, which is the Li or the Ji bloodline, which comes from the Chinese Xia dynasty, which produced all of the dynastic kings up until the time that communism was launched on China to take out that bloodline. And so you see Xi, who comes from the Western bloodline, that's XI. When I say Xia, that's XIA for the tribe. You see that bloodline resurging back in power, and he's about to rebuild a larger empire. And you see these 10 empire kings starting to sort of form, and you're going to have all of these bloodlines and these Antichrist rivals, and there can only be one. It's like the old Highlander show or movies. That right? That's the rivalry. There can only be one ruling family at the end. And so we need to keep all of that sort of in mind before we get out too far on a limb as to who Antichrist is. And if we are in the fig tree generation, then how long is that fig tree generation? And when did it start? Right? So in the time of the Exodus, you get 40 years as a generation. The book of Psalms says 70 years. And then Genesis 6:3, life is limited to 120 years. So depending on when you think that starts and how this is going to play out, also fits in as to how do we measure, are we in getting close to the time of Antichrist.
So if you think we're in the fig tree generation, when do you think that it started?
Well, for me, I would look at two main factors. Is number one in prophecy is that we get Israel mentioned back in the land of the covenant. And we have the southern kingdom that's back in. So one might say 1947 when they declared their independence, or 1948 when they won their war of independence might be a start date. I'm not convinced of that part. I would say the other part that we need to always keep in mind is Jerusalem is the epicenter of end time prophecy. And so they need to have had possession of Jerusalem. So if I would speculate to make a start date, I would say 1967 and then start that count forward. And so it's either 40, 70, or 120. And if it's 70 or 120, we may be a little bit ahead of our time before we start the last 7 years. So again, we want to be careful, and we don't know, the exact timing of when Antichrist comes to power, just sort of prophetically at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And we know the start of that last 7 years is when he will be one of the main leaders negotiating the world covenant sponsored by Babylon. So there's a lot of things yet to take place. We don't have a universal religion, right? And that's a big stumbling block. That has to happen first. And the false prophets have to come out. And then you have to have these 10 kings of the seventh empire that rise up. And we're just starting to see that. So we're somewhere in, I think, if we're in the fig tree generation, and I think we are, in the birth pangs or the birth sorrows.
Yes.
And we're going to see those catastrophes get stronger and work more, which will start to permit through that chaos the rise of these 10 kings and the false prophets coming out for Babylon.
Yes. So tell me, when I was in grad school, a lot of the work I did a lot of was mostly 19th century American history, and a lot of it was men's history and men's social organization. So a lot of Freemasonry. And the one paper I did in grad school that I did not get an A on was about Freemasonry and the Luciferian aspect of it. And my professor told me I was a religious fanatic, not a scholar. But that's not true, is it?
No, because
What is going on with the Freemasons? I mean, in the Catholic Church, that's a huge thing. I mean, you cannot be a Freemason, be a Catholic. Everyone says that all the popes have been Freemasons, all the bishops are Freemasons. It's a huge part of the conspiracy stuff in the Catholic Church. We were told vague things about how, Freemasonry welcomes all religions and you can't be a part of that because you have to, evangelize for Christ wherever you are, et cetera, and all that kind of thing. But no one ever kind of goes beyond that. So what's going on with Freemasonry, and what does it have to do with the giants, and what does it have to do with where we're going here?
Yeah, you've asked a lot of big questions there. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with the beginning of secret societies. And so this happens before the flood. It's an ancient organization, and it's an ancient organization of the royals and the elite. So it comes out of the mystery schools and out of Enochian mysticism before the flood. Enoch, son of Cain, not Enoch, son of Jared. There's two
Whoa,
Enochs.
so it has origins before the flood.
Yes.
Okay.
And that the knowledge that, according to the Gnostics and according to the Freemasons, who inherited the Masonic and Mason history, and I want to make clear because ancient Masons are a little different than modern Freemasons, and we can maybe get into that down in a couple of minutes. But according to them, Adam learns this great knowledge from God in Eden. And this knowledge, he's running this large facility from the Nile River to the Euphrates. And he's running orchards, and he's running domesticated animals, and he's growing all sorts of crops. As you take that language, it's not very clear in the English language, but you take that back to Hebrew, all of that's going on. And so he receives this knowledge from God to be able to do this. And he has to have a lot of knowledge because he's only provided one partner. So only two of them are going to manage this. So he has to have knowledge. And this knowledge, after they're ostracized, gets passed on to their offspring. So Cain, Abel, and Seth. Of course, Abel is murdered, and Cain is sent off, and he goes off to a place called Nod and takes this knowledge and he starts building a city for some unknown people. And he has a son named Enoch as his first son. So this knowledge is passed on to Cain, which is passed on to Enoch, according to the Masons. And the Enoch is the one who develops this knowledge into 7 different disciplines, and that they call the 7 sacred sciences. And these are the 7 liberal arts that we know today in university. And they're designed to lead people away from God and not give God credit for anything, and to defame God and dismiss him, and to honor their own pantheon of gods. And so they create Enochian mysticism, the sun-worshipping cult of before the flood, to honor the pantheon of the gods, because Cain has rejected God and is following the fallen angels. And then illicit knowledge is passed on to these descendants. And then the fallen angels will intermarry with the Canaanites to create the original Nephilim. And they take over the antediluvian world with this hierarchy, organizational structure, and advanced knowledge. And this knowledge is going to be developed through the mystery schools to educate the elite, and the secret societies that trace their history back to coming out of the mystery schools. And we see that kind of thing today on a very sort of superficial level. So at all the universities, you have all of these initiated organizations, right? That's part of the history. And this is an initiatory, oath-based system. So just as we saw King Charles III take the oath to a god, that's not the God of the Bible, that's a god of the pantheon that he worships and takes his genealogies back to. Everything's oath-based, and that's why we're told not to swear to oaths in the Bible, because that's part of the legal system of the invisible ones, the celestial mafia that rule this world for a little while longer. And it begins back then. And so this is the knowledge that was used to build the pyramids, according to the Masons. And then that the pyramids would also be built before the flood, which makes more
Can I
sense.
just interject? So what's just clarify again the difference between the knowledge that was given to Adam that he used to, subdue the earth, and then this perverted knowledge?
Well, this is knowledge that the Book of Enoch adds some context to. It's illicit knowledge that wasn't permitted to be taught to humans. And it's knowledge that is going to be used. So the angels
brought that. The fallen angels brought that. Okay.
Yeah. And it's knowledge that is going to be used to destroy the earth. And we talked about destruction of plant genome and DNA earlier that happened before the flood, and technology that can destroy the world. And we're seeing a lot of that, which is probably why we're in the days of Noah again.
Wow, that is wild. So they were doing that all the way back then. They're doing all this crazy science stuff. Okay.
Yeah. And we're just catching up to that. That's the amazing thing.
Yeah.
Because we can't build those facilities, that things that they built before the flood, that we can't even do that today. So now this whole knowledge base in religion has to cross the flood. So in Masonic history, and they take their patriarchs, let me back up, they list their patriarchs to their secret societies as Cain, but Enoch is a higher level because of what he did. Lamech, again, of the Cain line, there's two Lamechs, one of the Seth line, one of the Cainite line. Tubal-Cain, Nama, Jubal, and Jubal. And they were, when we get descriptions of them developing this knowledge, some of this knowledge in the book of Genesis, but in the occult belief system, they're really the progenitors to the development and renaissance of this knowledge in the time of the creation of the giants and the time of Lamech and his sons. And those are the most famous of their patriarchs. Now, they know about the coming of the flood somehow, some way, probably maybe because Noah's preaching it to them, or their gods are telling them that there's a disaster coming. And so they want to preserve this knowledge. So they build two pillars. One is designed to survive destruction by fire. One is destruction by flood. And so after the flood, a fellow by the name of Harmines, which we would know as Hermes, from the Hermes Trismegistus. I know, it's just, we could talk about them for hours too, and all of these interconnections. He finds the pillar. So obviously the one that floats, and he finds the knowledge that was written down in 36,525 books, also has all the information of the Enochian religion. So he has the Enochian religion, the Enochian knowledge, and it's buried under the Great Pyramids. And he takes it, according to Masonic history, back to Nimrod, who builds Babel City and Babel Tower. And they're going to build this tower up to heaven. And it's also said in the Bible, to paraphrase it, that acting as one people with one language, anything they now intend to do, they'll be able to do. That's a reflection of this knowledge, I think, that the Masons are talking about, and why you have, one of the reasons why you have this dispersion of the people and the confusion of the languages. But Nimrod is one of their great patriarchs as well. And remember, I said he started the Mesopotamian hybrid bloodlines, beginning with the Elamites. Or the Olamim, as you would take that back to ancient Hebrew. And he writes the first constitution for the Masons after the flood. And there's a first Grand Master, and is reflective of the fifth science, which is geometry or masonry, the art of building. And then that is going to be passed on to the Magi in Mesopotamia, and then over, as Hermes and Mizraim go over to Egypt, they're going to start the Egyptian religion, and then they're going to inherit that knowledge or rewrite the constitution of Nimrod in Heliopolis. And that's why Egypt is so much part of the Masonic society and history as well, because of that second pillar of polytheism after the flood. And so that's the history where they take their beginnings from. And now if we understand that it's the royals, it's the nobility that are being educated all throughout our history until recent times. And if we understand that these orders have a hierarchy and the royals are at the top of the hierarchy, we can now start to understand what's going on in our modern times. And if we now go back to the Templars that we talked about, who were created by royals, they are sort of the modern wedge of ancient masonry, but after their fall in 1307 by the Catholic Church and the King of France, they're going to have to, that society is going to have to be rebuilt, and it's going to be decentralized going forwards. And so you have a group after 1188 at Geyser Castle at the cutting of the elm, a splitting of the Templars and the senior order of the bloodlines, because the Templars lost their way and were more focused on banking and wealth and stuff like that than the protection of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem fell in 1187. You're going to have the senior order of the Prior Sion create another order of the Rosy Cross order that is going to be working in secrecy. And then after the fall of the Knights Templar, that's going to be one of the major organizations of the bloodline orders. And
That's
that
the
order is going,
Rosicrucians, right?
the Rosicrucians, yeah.
Right.
Now I'll come back to them when I get to the high levels of the order of the Thelemic tree of the hierarchy of the secret societies. But you're going to have a new Masonic order that's created shortly after the fall of the Knights Templar. So you have some Templar adepts that escaped to Scotland, to Robert the Bruce, who's been excommunicated by the Pope for killing his rival in a Catholic church, and offers protection. And the Sinclairs are there, the St. Clairs, which was a battle partner to Hugh de Payon, and also the family associated with Geyser Castle. And they're from the Rollo bloodline of Sweden. But again, I can't go down that rabbit trail right now. But staying with the St. Clair family is a transliteration of St. Clair. And they're the ones who create Freemasonry after the fall of the Knights Templar with the adepts. And then what Robert the Brute does in 1323 is he elevates another order, which is sort of the official, sort of first visible sign that we see for the Rosy Cross order made up of the adepts. And at that point in time, you had another organization made above them and another one above that. So at the time of the fall of the Knights Templar, there was 33 invisible ones who are trying to reinstate the Knights Templar into the Catholic Church. But there's a falling out with the Pope because he was not going to let them run the group. He was going to put his own people in there. And so they decide that they're going to go underground, and they create the Committee of 300 Families. These are the 33 families who report to the 13 families that we know today. So at the top of the Thelemic tree are the 13 families. Below them is the Council of 33. Below them is the Committee of 300. Below them is the Rosicrucians, which is 50% representative of purebloods. And then coming up from the lower orders are rising initiated adepts. So the Illuminati would report to the Rosicrucians, and the Freemasons report to the Illuminati. And first level of adepthood through the secret society organization versus the bloodlines, which I'll explain in a second, begins with modern Freemasonry, and you don't know anything until you're an adept. So 3rd degree York Rite, 33rd degree Scottish Rite, just, 3 split 11 times in each of the degrees.
So most of the people that are Freemasons have no idea about any of this.
Yeah. So when they're invited to join, they have to be of bloodlines and of a genealogy that the Masons already know of to join. But if you're not an adept, you're still what they call mundane. And only at adept level are you taught who Lucifer is and that he's the real God. So they say that you have to honor a God to join Freemasonry, but when you start swearing your oaths to Lucifer, you're only accepting Lucifer or Hal-El or the great architect of the universe, or all different names for the same individual. Hal-El is the Hebrew word for Lucifer in the King James Version Bible. And then you have the Illuminati who are above them. Now, each of these groups in the Thelemic tree are what I call a trunk organization. And you have the pure bloodlines at the top. So when I talked about the Golden Fleece Order, that's one of the 13 families orders. So you would have the Rollo bloodline, they have the Knights of the Seraphim. You have the Order of the Garter for the Windsor Hanover bloodline, and so on and so forth. They have their own royal orders. Now, within these trunk organizations, they oversee what they call branch organizations. And so imagine this evergreen tree that have these branches that go in and it goes all around the tree. So each of those organizations oversee hierarchies of organizations in each of those branches and those extended branches as they branch off. And so as an example, and each of these organizations have a specific agenda to bring about the New World Order and the universal religion and the coming of Antichrist. So for example, you have in the US, you have, let's say, the Bohemian Grove, where everybody sort of in the mythos understands that if you're going to be president, you have to be initiated through there and you have to be approved, and that's where you get the support. Well, they report into the Illuminati, okay, is one of those organizations. So people have heard the Skull and Bones, and the both Bush and Gore were Skull and Bones in the 2000 election. And that's, again, at the university level, where we have, again, that history that goes back to the mystery schools of these orders. This is a bloodline order at the Ivy League, right? And they're an Illuminati pure blood order, and they report in. So if you move up, let's say, to the Committee of 300, you would have organizations like the Bilderbergers, and they have two groups. You have the new money, like the Gates coming in, who meet with the bloodlines of like the, you know, the royal bloodline of the Dutch, and they own Shell and people like that, who would give the marching orders to the new money who want to intermarry into these bloodlines for future generations to have their children have a larger role in the world order. They go back and do their instructions every year from the Bilderberg meeting. And you have the IMF, you have the World Economic Forum, you have the World Bank, anything to do with economics reports into the Committee of 300. The Club of Rome is another one. So, and these are all different branches that go out, and they have all these other mini organizations in their own hierarchies. So it's best to understand the secret society order as a thelemic tree. And that's one of their words. It's interesting that one of the trees that grew on Mount Hermon, from where the Baalim rule from, where they give the divine right to rule, was the cedars of Lebanon, as they're known, a cedar tree. And that's the imagery for their thelemic tree. Another great tree was the great elm tree, or the ash tree and oak tree. They're considered synonymous in the occult, that grew in Mount Hermon. These are the trees that are also used to describe the Amorites of Mount Hermon in Amos 2, right? The thelemic tree, the elm tree, is the elm tree that was split in 1188 at Geezer's Castle in a ritual splitting of the Priory of Sion from the Knights Templar that we talked about earlier. It is Orme in French, and just as the Templars had a giant elm tree that they did all of their adjudication from in Paris, it's a very important tree in the occult. It's also the family genealogical tree that you see in imagery. When you see a family tree, that's their thelemic genealogical tree that traces their genealogies that they created that for, and all the different branches of those bloodlines and stuff, right? and and these roots go down into their heaven, which is Hades or Sheol, where their gods, they believe their gods rule from, not the heaven of earth. So when they hear the inverted doctrine of as in heaven as on earth, or as on earth so in heaven, I got that wrong. It's so in heaven as on earth. And you get that in the Lord's Prayer, but they turn everything upside down and inside out. So what happens in earth is what happens in their heaven, which is below, not above, right? And they get their power from the roots that go down into these trees in that allegory into the inner earth, where Hades and Sheol is located, likely in another dimension. And also takes back to, in the genealogical tree, those roots would go back to specific Nephilim that are in Hades and Sheol, and to specific gods. So their layers of allegory is incredible. The size of their operation is unimaginable. And they have such an overwhelming presence that they can control education. They can control everything that goes on and control all of the information. So when I said these groups have certain agendas, you have the Freemasons, who are looking after, for the most part, politics and the army. And so when you mention what happened in the US, I mean, it was created to help bring about the New World Order. That's why you have so much Freemasonic participation in the revolution and in the Constitution. And the Illuminati is focused on destroying Christianity and focused on world government. Now, the Rosicrucians were assigned to look after the history, the genealogies, and the entertainment, and the literature, and the arts.
I saw this last week. I watched over a few days. I don't know if you've seen this 5-hour YouTube video by this Australian young man, pop star. I think he won like The Voice or something a few years ago. He did a 5-hour video exposing Freemasonry in politics and entertainment. And he had literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos of big celebrities and politicians doing all the Masonic hand signs.
Yeah.
How much of this is true, that all of these celebrities are involved in this?
A lot of them are, not all of them, but a lot of them are. And so it's not the Masons that control the entertainment, it's the Rosicrucians. So,
okay.
Walt Disney was Rosicrucian, for example. He's also Freemasonic, but he's also Rosicrucian. Okay, starts to make some sense. So the entertainment knowledge, for the most part, if they're not part of the bloodlines, if they're just a low bloodline or being used and being initiated at the lower levels, that information is being provided by the Rosicrucians. So when you see science fiction, horror movies, Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, this is all knowledge that's provided to them to write about and then to act. And there's a host that I do some shows with fairly regularly. He came out of the occult and was out of radio and things like that. And to move forward, you had to swear oaths to them and do what they wanted to do. And if you didn't, then you'd be sort of banned out for the most part. And he decided he wasn't going to do what they were going to do. So he knows a lot about the occult, and now he works to expose them as well. So it's quite common. I wanted to mix into that now, because it'll make perfect sense with what you were talking about. What this fellow was talking is that if you are of a royal bloodline of the highest sort of levels, you are initiated from childhood. And so you're an adept before you become an adult. But you're not allowed to take an adept title somewhere between 25 and 30 years old is what I understand. And when we understand that the arts are controlled by the elite, always have been, just as a recorded history is, and you start looking at the Greek classics, for example, which is all about the gods, all about their
Yeah.
spurious offspring, all about their
Right.
genealogies, all about their history and their religion, that is the same thing that is going to come down through the Romans, like with Ovides and Metamorphos, and roll that forward to Francis Bacon, who some
Right.
people think was Shakespeare. He forms two writing societies. One is called the Knights of the Helmet, and the other one is the Spear Shaker Society, named after Athena and Apollo, who held this spear that they shook and were supporters of the arts, probably where the name Shakespeare comes from, just that inverted usage again. And they're there to write literature, but in a new language. They're going to take Old or Middle English and make it into a modern English that is going to be designed for the expansion of the English Empire that King James is going to take over in 1601. And that's going to be the same language that's going to be used into the King James Version Bible. So they write, and Shakespeare writes all about the history of the gods and the nobles. Again, it's just the religion, the preservation of the religion, preservation of the gods and the genealogies. And, you know, it gets into one that's like Midsummer's Night Dream. And you have like, you know, Titania, who's a female giant name from the Titanades out of Greek, and married to the king of the fairies. Trying to think of his name. It escapes me right now. That goes back to,
it's been way too long.
yeah, but
or maybe not.
again, this fairy culture is all part of their religion and history. Now, roll this forward, understanding that you have these writing societies. Roll that forward to early 1900s and 1930s, and you get two great writers that show up who are going to write about the occult in all sorts of ways and become so famous, and one of them very highly recognized in Christianity. And you have Lewis and Tolkien. So they show up at Oxford in the 1930s. So you have to have money at this particular time to be at Oxford. They're going to join a Rosicrucian writing society, the Inklings.
Oh, I didn't know that about them either. Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Oh,
Now
geez.
they say, well, there's no way that they would be Masonic or Freemasons because there's no record of it. Well, they're only there to learn the writing craft. They already have the knowledge. They've been taught from childhood. And so if people want to get a hold of me, I'll send them I have documents on this, a 6-part series. But not only do I talk about how they're talking about occult history, and you can see it in everything that you write once your eyes open up. Parts 5 and 6, I take their bloodlines back. These are royales. And so they didn't have to be Masonic. They're an adept already, and they already have the knowledge of the Rosicrucians and higher ups. They're just there to learn their writing craft. This is what happens all throughout our history. They control the arts. And, you know, they also control the education. So another society that was created, as all these other societies that were being created, were was the Invisible College, or the Royal Society as we understand it. It was created by the Rosicrucians and the Freemasons and put into a doctrine in 1662. And it was designed to control the education and science outside the Catholic Church. The Jesuits, which we talked about, who Ignatius of Loyola was initiated through the Mary apparitions to bring about the new Babylon, which is the Templar dream, was to bring about the new Babylon within the Catholic Church.
Well, that worked.
Yeah. He's a Basque and a Royale. He's not this poor monk.
Wow.
So he is freed from prison during the Inquisitions by a fellow by the name of Francis Borgia, Francis Borgia, and he is a bloodline descendant of 3 popes. And his grandfather was a pope as well. And again, from the Italian nobility, there's an intermarriage going on between Spain and Italy. And so he frees Francis out, funds him in his early period, helps with with King Charles, because Francis is in the court of King Charles, the Holy Roman Empire, who invades Italy, gets the Jesuits sponsored for a society as the new Templars within the Roman Church. And by 1550 or 1555, Ignatius is passed on, but Francis Borgia becomes a Jesuit. And then by about 1660, he becomes the 3rd Grand Master of the Jesuits, and as one of the major founders of the Jesuits. What's interesting about Borgia, he was also the Grand Master of the Montesa order. And the Montesa order was made by the King of Spain at the time of the fall of the Templars to protect all of the Templar assets, so the Catholic Church doesn't get that. And he becomes Grand Master of this, working in the Spanish court. This is Francis Borgia, and he is working with the king to get control of the Vatican banking and to get control of the Catholic education. So the Jesuits get a hold of the banking by the 1570s, and with part of their papal bulls, they've got control of the education.
It sounds like you're just talking about the modern day right now. Like everything that you're talking about, even the names, King George, Francis.
Well, because they keep those names and geologies alive. So now the Rothschilds were formed as the Bauer family out of Germany, changed their name to the Rothschilds.
They're the real bad ones, right?
Nope. Still lower. They would probably report into the Committee of 300. So they're a Jewish family and Jewish German family that are going to be intermarrying into the Royals. And they're sponsored by the Masonic societies as the banking arm outside of the Catholic Church. So just as they wanted the Royal Society for education and science outside the Catholic Church, and just as they established the Jesuits to get control of education and banking within the church, now you're going to have the Rothschilds who are going to have control of banking outside of the church. And so as they expand, they get bigger and they get more wealthier and they get control of the banking. And they changed their name to Rothschilds when they set up the London Bank, because they wanted to get that separation. And of course, Rothschilds is just another Masonic allegory for a red shield or a red cross, right? It's all sort of reflective of that. And they're the ones who sponsor the pseudo blue bloods and bankers in North America, whether or not you're talking about the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Carnegie. They fund all of them to get control of banking and industry in North America, and they're like their stable of agents over here. And so what's also interesting is now you mix in that most of the wealth went from France, where that was their head office. Most of the Templar wealth went over to Switzerland and to the Knights of St. John, who had already set up there, and they accepted escaping Templar adepts as well. And that the Knights of St. John has that white cross. And so they became the true funding of Swiss banking. So now you have that established at the fall of the Templars. They get control of the Jesuit banking. They move that over to Switzerland, and the Rothschilds have their banking now located in Switzerland. And you have pretty much all of the world banking controlled out of Switzerland, and all connected to royal families and secret societies.
Okay. Wow. So what do these people do? Like, do these people worship Lucifer? Do they do rituals? Do they, I mean, are
Yep.
they actively doing these kinds of things?
Yeah, at first level of adept, they're told who Lucifer is, and that he is an equal to the God of the Bible. And in their dualistic religion, there's this ongoing perpetual good versus evil. It's just that they believe they're the good guys and we're the evil people. So again, it's totally inverted, inside out and upside down. And so they also recognize Lucifer as the great architect of the universe. And that's also important to understand as well. And they
So when
swear an oath.
Masons say that, they worship the architect of the universe, they're actually talking about Lucifer, not Yahweh.
Yes, yeah, not Yahweh. Yeah, they say God made a mess of the universe and Lucifer cleaned it up. And Lucifer is an Italian word for Venus, which is another allegory substituted into the English language for a Hebrew word.
Which
And
has come up in the occult and for over a century with Madame Blavatsky and all of that.
Yep. And the occult associates their god with Venus, right? So Lucifer is kind of a word that derives from light and Venus out of Italian. And so when we have them swearing their oaths to Lucifer, understand that's a contract. Only God can trump that, and we know God has the power to do it. We have Moses, who is when he dies, Satan shows up to claim him. Why? Because Moses was brought up in the Pharaoh royal bloodline, educated at Heliopolis, was a polytheist, swore all of those oaths, and so Satan was rightfully there to claim him. But God sent Michael because he trumped it, because he had selected Moses to go through this process and to learn things about Egypt so that he could communicate in the right way and take on the power of the priests and everything as he does. So that was all part of sort of God's plan, but Satan still made claim to that, which is the power that people need to understand that go with these oaths. So stay away from oaths and initiatory organizations obviously it can be broken, but you're still going to be held accountable. So we have to be careful with that. And so the great architect of the universe was also known as the god of Mithraism and the god of Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was the religion of the Aryans, which are one of the groups of the Indo-Aryans and the giants after the flood. And it was the religion of Persia and the religion of Hinduism, because the Aryans also settled in the Indus Valley. And Mithraism is one of those religions that when Constantine was implementing Christianity as his religion for the empire, he was homogenizing Mithraism into Christianity. And so we see some of that sort of came down through Christianity. So the birth of Mithras is December 25, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the date arbitrarily selected to celebrate Christ's birthday. So, and we don't know when Christ was born, except that we know it was it was not in the rainy season, because the cattle was in the pastures, not in the stables. And that's why Mary and Joseph were able to get housing to stay over in the stable. And that's where Jesus was born. So we have that part that is this ancient sort of record of this great architect of the universe. And we see a lot of that word of arch and archmason and that goes throughout the hierarchy of Christianity, whether it's an archdeacon, archbishop. All of those words are designed to reflect, and I'm not saying Catholicism or Christianity is polytheist. I'm not saying that. I'm saying a lot of the leadership as done bad things
Yes, indeed.
throughout our history, but that does not displace what the Bible says. Our religions might try and displace what the
Yes.
Bible says,
Yes,
but
understood.
that's a whole different thing. So I just wanted to be sort of clear on that. So yeah, the great architect of the universe is an ancient title that goes back to the same God. And the whole world, idea of architecture and masonry, it's all sort of interrelated as well. So I kind of cover off some of that in the new book as well. So
The all of this goes back to these fallen angels. I mean, they're basically giving humanity technology, forbidden knowledge in exchange for worship, right? So and again, being so involved these days in UFO research, I earlier this year I had my at the actually the end of last year after Christmas, I had my mentor from grad school over with his wife for brunch, and they had just moved into a retirement home near Northwestern University, just north of Chicago. And his wife said, "Oh, Ursula should," because I told him I was working on UFO stuff, and his wife said Ursula needs to meet David. And it turned out to be they moved into the same retirement home with David Jacobs. Do you know David Jacobs, the ufologist? He is a big, well-known character in ufology. He was, like myself, a cultural historian at Temple University for many years, tenured professor. And he was friends with J. Allen Hynek, another big name in ufology, who did a lot of work on abduction research.
Yep.
And David Jacobs started to do abduction research as well. And he got really involved with hypnotizing people that had these experiences. And I think he did something like 1,100 hypnosis sessions, and every one of them gave the same information, which was basically the person was abducted. They were brought into some sort of a craft, and it was revealed to them that there's this hybridization program going on where these alien beings are creating hybrid beings with humans, very similar to what we've been talking about, right? So and a lot of people think that these alien encounters, these abductions, are just this modern version of what we've been talking about. What do you think about all this? Do you think that it's a lot of people say it's the return of the Nephilim, that these fallen angels are creating a whole new race of Nephilim, which are supposedly these alien hybrids that claim that they're from outer space?
Sure. So let's first sort of expand the concept of Nephilim creation. There's more than just giants that were created by the gods, by the fallen angels. And in prehistory, in polytheism, we get told about these creatures. You have everything from a Sasquatch type creature to chimeras to little people. So the fairies and neuroids.
So how were they all these
thousands.
beings created?
Well, typically they're all created through sexual copulation in the same way. I think there's some DNA manipulation that's going to go on as well, because chimeras had multiple types of animals that were mixed in. So they, like King Hababa had, he's a typical chimera of the cedar forest in the Epic of Gilgamesh. But chimera, and as we understand today, is it's trying to create a being that has multiple types of animals, right? That's what they're trying to do with it in science today. That comes, a word out of Greek mythology. Surprise, surprise. They honor their gods and their history and everything they do. So whether or not it's that or a combination. And the other thing I like to keep in mind is when I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he and Upnapishtim were 2/3 God and 1/3 human. It's not 50-50. So one wonders whether or not within that type of creation, they can do that type of splitting somehow, some way with their angelic technology into thirds and maybe even more. But that sort of implies manipulation again. So I think there's both of that. That's part of it. So there's a hierarchy in the fallen ones. And biblically, we're told about the visible ones and the invisible ones. And they work together. So it's invisible ones that are the fallen angels and the disembodied spirits of the giants.
Okay.
And then the visible ones are the ones that would be the descendants, as we would understand them, the royals today, or newly created ones, if that's what they're doing or are going to be doing, and other kinds of creations that were all spirits' offspring that either were somehow survived the flood or were again recreated again after the flood in some sort of second incursion and in the same format as what happened before the flood. So within that hierarchy, then we can start to look at what this alien phenomena can be all about. And that a lot of the alien mythology actually has them coming through portals as opposed to interplanetary. So I think
Right.
interdimensional is more likely, just as we talked about that there's a dimension of Sheol and Hades, there's a dimension of heaven, and we don't know how many dimensions there are. I mean, the Bible tells us three, the polytheists believe in seven, but we know there's at least three. And that portals are a big part of the occult as well.
Sure.
Now, in the types of creations that the fallen angels made, were a group called the elementals. And as we talked about the fairies earlier, and King Oberon, as now that is coming back to me, was the king of the fairies that married Titania in Midsummer's Night Dream, which is a Tuatha De Danann or Scythian term. It goes back to Uber and Uberon and Oberon, and it's all different transliterations of the same kingly ruler and title. You have four groups of elementals that were created. In the first book, I talk about three groups, and in the fourth book, I talk about the fourth group. And because they are interrelated to what we see in the alien mythos, both today and in history. And just as we understand these creatures were created in prehistory as well, and they're either reproducing or needing humans to reproduce or have been reproduced again. Somehow they're still here. So in the elementals of the three little peoples, there are good-looking ones like, Tinkerbell and ones like that in the little people, and there's the mischievous ones, let's say like leprechauns, for example. And these are the same groups all over the world. It's common. It's a common history. And all over the world, it goes back into prehistory, just like they show up in the Lord of the Rings.
I've encountered fairies and
yeah.
ghost hunting,
Yeah.
actually, believe it or not. Well, I'm sure you do believe it,
Yeah.
but most people wouldn't.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So the third group are the ugly ones, and that includes like the dwarves, who, as in Lord of the Rings, they lived in the earth and made weapons for the demigods. Right.
Yep.
And there's another group that has flying machines, spaceships. They had come through portals, fairy portals. They abduct people. They do sexual experimentation on them. They have a fertility issue. People are taken and don't have a memory of what happened. And this happens throughout our history in all cultures.
Wow.
And they're called the Grey Neighbors, for example, in England or in Scotland. And
did you say gray?
I did. I'm getting to that. Yep. And I did say gray. And
okay.
They have a group called the Gnomes. And the Gnomes in the occult history looked after the genealogies and the technology, the angelic technology. And the Gnomes are known as the Greys. And these fairy abductions, and I put two in my first book, if you didn't know it was a fairy abduction, you'd swear it was a great alien abduction because they're described identically. Now, one of the other groups that seems to be higher up in the alien mythos are the reptilians. And they're said to be a little bit taller than humans. And there's a whole bunch of different stories. They live in the earth, they have flying machines, they have, don't know about all of that. What I do know is the fourth group of elementals in the occult is called the salamanders, and they are reptilian. And not sure where they come. Either they're a spurious offspring like the Nephilim, but different than the Nephilim. And they're higher up in the hierarchy and larger than the little people. They could be a another type of creation, or they could have been ones that survive from prehistory with the help of fallen angels or recreated. And there is a creature that is reptilian in the Bible. There is a creature that's walking, talking, intelligent that deceives Eve called the serpent, Nahash in Hebrew. And then afterwards, it loses its legs, its limbs, its speech, its intelligence. And we're not told where or how that serpent is created, other than it's a beast of the field. So one presumes before day 6 that it's created. And it is obviously, as you take that back to its Hebrew meanings, it word means enchanter and words associated with the occult religion. So they were already corrupted by the fallen angels, which is why they were either led to or coerced to, or maybe Satan avatared into as an avatara. Nakash would be the avatara to deceive Eve. I think he coached them, and they were already corrupted, but they were punished. Satan wasn't punished. So it wasn't Satan who did it. Satan didn't lose his arms, didn't lose his legs, and so on and so forth. So these ones are higher up in the occult hierarchy, and they're part of the ancient alien mythos as well. So that might be where they come from. Now, the fallen angels, they're shapeshifters, just as some of the elementals can take different forms in the mythos. But for sure, angels and gods are shapeshifters. In polytheism, for example, Zeus, who can take a physical form as a human, also takes the shape of a wolf. And that's how the werewolf mythology comes about through King Lycaon, that he changes in his whole family. And angels are spirit beings. So they can take a physical form. And we know they can, because in Sodom and the Gomorrah story, and the two angels that also show up with the angel of the Lord to Abraham, they're physical, they eat, they drink, they touch, and they're in human form. And we're also told in the book of Hebrews that we better be nice to strangers, because you never know when you might come across an angel. So we know they can take physical form. And that's called an oiketerion, the soul and a body, where the spirit is living. And so in the physical world, fallen angels, when they left their habitation, which is the Greek word oiketerion in Jude 1:6, also shows up as house of heaven in 2 Corinthians 5:2, means dwelling place for the spirit. So they left their dwelling place for the spirit in heaven, but interact physically in the physical world. They need a physical body. So they need an oiketerion. That's how they pass on their DNA. That's how they reproduce the giants. And so they can take any shape that they want. They can take any gender that they want. That's how you have the female gods in polytheism, because some took a male gender, some took a female gender. And just as in Greek mythology, you have female gods producing with human men to produce heroes and giants of old. You have the same thing going on in Sumerian prehistory, as with Gilgamesh, who is father is King Lugabanda, and the mother is the mother goddess Nin. So we see that constant that happens throughout polytheism and reflected in their gods. So they can take any form they want and present a larger sort of population of types of alien beings, because they can take any shape that they want. And it's important to also understand that the Nephilim are going to be part of this mix as well. And, just as you see the Anunnaki of heaven and the Anunnaki of earth, that is part of the ancient alien mythos, and also watchers, as they're also called, we should expect to see some sort of giants in the end time, somehow, some way. I think descendants, but it could be aliens, that are representing themselves as aliens as well. But you also have the disembodied spirits of the giants that died. They're going to need an Oiketerian to interact in the physical world.
Yeah.
And the ones that are the terrible ones that come out of the abyss just before the midpoint of the last 7 years at the time of the Gog War probably are going to be provided Oiketerians that are like cloned bodies or something like that. And they're going to be part of the Gog War. When you see that Chimera army in Revelation 9,
yeah. Ooh. Yeah.
demonstrates that angelic technology again. And those are the same creatures that are described in Joel 1 and 2. And it is not the Armageddon War. It is the counterfeit Armageddon War that Antichrist will take credit for winning.
Yeah. Did these fallen angels make the dinosaurs?
I think they probably did. I mean, they're giant creatures, which is, but they're also reptilian. And the word before dinosaur was dragon. So they changed the name after the Royal Society, became from dragon over to dinosaur. Again, I think to sort of put a little bit of space into the history. Now,
was the guy that invented the dinosaurs, was he Freemason? Probably, right?
Yes. Yep.
I can't remember his name.
If you look at what they're saying about the dinosaurs now, is that many of them had feathers. Right? And so you have this feathered serpent, just as in the Kishimaya, you have the plume serpent, the feathered serpent. We talked about seraphim, I think, early on in the show. And these are six-winged, serpent-faced angels that work before the altar of God. And they're watchers. And that's an angelic dragon, as they're also known. Just as Satan's called a dragon and a serpent. And so these fallen angels had a tendency to procreate after their image. So the kings, the original Nephilim and Rephaim, they're all have serpentine imagery, just as the gods have these serpentine and dragon imagery, just as they're called the dragon creator gods in China. It's the same gods and watchers all around the earth that are participating in the creation of these giants. And the original kings look just like them. So you have a cache that may have been produced by God, or it may have been produced by fallen angels that look just like these serpentine beings. You have the salamanders that are part of the mythos. And so I think they created those as dragons in the image of themselves, the serpentine type of beings.
Yeah. Your subtitle of your book includes "To Enslave Humankind." And it reminded me of a lot of the Native Americans, especially up in the Northwest, talk about these. They seem to be elementals, the stick Indians, and those sorts of things. Then they include in their stories about them that they kidnap people and enslave them.
Yeah.
And you see this in the fairy stories, also a lot of those about the enslavement. What's going to happen to us with these secret societies and these royal lines? What are they going to do to us?
Ultimately, they would like to wipe us from the face of the earth, to be remembered no more. Just as the giant nations tried to wipe Israel from the face of the earth, to be remembered no more.
Depopulation?
More than that, to, let me sort of back up a couple of steps here so that we have a sort of better understanding as to why I made that statement. So humankind is created after the angelic rebellion. The Adamites are created as a resolution to the angelic rebellion that is completed at the end of the last 7 years. And that their destiny, the Adamite destiny, is to be raised into immortality, to be like angels, and to inherit eternity. So likely to be above angels. And we're actually going to judge those angels who sinned against us and sinned against the earth. And that ever since the Adamite creation, the fallen angels have been trying to make sure that we don't reach that destiny. So the original plan was to wipe them from the face of the earth in a series of different ways, ideally to lead all of them away from God so that they couldn't be raised up and saved. So the first revenge is in Eden. The second revenge is to create the spurious offspring, to lead the world into total destruction. And they almost succeed, except for 8 with the flood. And God permits more time, so all the names can be fulfilled. They are on the path to be successful, except that God knows all of this is going to happen because he's Alpha Omega. He knows the beginning from the end. And he knew they would deceive Adam. He knew they would create the giants. He knew the giants would show up after the flood. He is permitting it because he permits everything through free choice. But God is greater than free choice as Alpha Omega. So it's being played out. And so there was a crossroads in this plan that the fallen angels overlooked. And they didn't anticipate, as the book of Corinthians talks about, the resurrection. And we know that because it says in the book of Corinthians that had they known about the resurrection, they would not have ensured Christ was crucified, because that sealed their fate.
Right.
And so while Jesus was still in the grave, he actually goes and visits these spirits in the pit prison in book of 1 Peter 3 and is talking to them. We're not told what he said. My speculation is he's basically saying, when I rise from heaven, you and all of your followers are sentenced, is sealed to go to the lake of fire, and humankind, a certain percentage will be resurrected as originally planned. And so in the book of Matthew, we're told that the lake of fire was designed specifically for the devil, Satan, and his followers, or the fallen angels, and those who take the mark of the beast, which seems to be an increase in what the humans do to qualify for that. That would probably imply a sin against the Holy Spirit, because again, as the book of Matthew talks about, that's the only sin that's not forgiven.
So that's refusing and rejecting Christ's salvation.
Yeah, I think it's going to be even more than that, to go to the lake of fire and to remain there forever. The lake of fire is used for the second death, but there's a select group who take the mark who are going to burn forever there, like Antichrist, like the false prophet, like Satan and the fallen angels.
Boy, okay. So what's a Christian to do?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. So this is, the first thing is that it's so big that it's really sort of hard to get your head around. And there's so much brainwashing that has gone on, not only in our generation, but throughout our history, to make sure we don't understand. And we can't necessarily stop what's going to happen. But what we can do is prepare, and what we can do is try and communicate to other Christians to wake up. Because as Jesus said, even the elect will be deceived by Antichrist. And so much so, and he backs this up in his testimony in the book of Revelation, that's presented by the angel to John, that God will that God will not only ensure through Jesus that we are saved from the wrath, which is the last year of the last 7 years, but the hour of trial. The hour of trial is timed in the same hour as the two witnesses finished their 3.5-year prophesying, which is the midpoint of the last 7 years when Antichrist and the one who comes up out of the abyss slays them. The same hour, this hour of trial and temptation, is that we're going to be saved from the hour that the 10 kings hand their power over to Antichrist, who's going to destroy Babylon. And it is the same hour that Babylon is destroyed in Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, so that Antichrist can set up his throne and his religion in the last 3.5 years. And it is the same hour that's talked about just before we get the summary of the last 3.5 years in Revelation 14. And that time of trial or temptation that would deceive even the elect could only be that we have to be saved from, because the delusions will be that powerful, would be the mark of the beast. So we need to enlighten people, because so many people aren't going to recognize what's going on, and they're going to be overwhelmed by things that we can't imagine.
Yeah. Signs and wonders.
Yeah, and so much more. I mean, can you imagine if, at the time of that hour is the time of the war in heaven, where in heaven you have this war, and all the angels that came out of the abyss and all the ones that weren't sent to the abyss that were rebellious as well are all now sent down to the earth for the last 3.5 years. And after all of those horrible things that happened in the first 3.5 years, this is also the time that Antichrist in Daniel 8:10, as part of this invasion into heaven, is going to throw down some of the starry host and capture them. They're going to make it seem like they can take on the God of the Bible and win a realm on their own, as Lucifer always wanted. Now, let me just sort of bring that back to Nimrod, and that nothing is new under the sun. What will be again. In the occult version of Nimrod, when he's building this tower, he's threatening God. He's shaking his weapons at God and says, if you ever get out of line again, I'm going to come into heaven and I'm going to slay you. I mean, the God of an Antichrist type figure, and Nimrod has universal sway over all of the Noahites with his Enochian mysticism that he has put on them. So he has the universal religion in place, and he's an Antichrist type figure. And he's trying to build this place into heaven. You can't build something stone into heaven. Nimrod stays in Shinar, or Sumer. And one of those groups of people that he produces are the Akkadians. And in the Akkadian version and other Sumerian versions, at the like the tower at Eridu, for example, Babel is called Babalu. So similar name, but has that ILU instead of the EL. And so it doesn't mean confusion of languages in Akkadian. It means ILU or EL as in a god or an angel, and Bab as in a stargate, a portal, words like that. And so if you can imagine that he just inherited the antediluvian technology of angelic technology that Hermes brought with him. They're building this tower, and an ancient alien mythos and occult history is that these towers were built on power grid lines, and that they were a technology as well, and that they could create portals in that technology. Think about what that means with what Nimrod, as an Antichrist type figure, was saying he was going to do. Probably one of two things. One, he would go into the dimension of Hades, of Sheol, to let his gods out of the abyss prison. And he was going to invade heaven so he could set up his throne in heaven to be like God, just as Lucifer tried to do. This is what Antichrist does in the end time. He doesn't succeed in overthrowing, but he succeeds in getting into heaven, which is that interdimension angelic technology that is being developed today through AI and quantum computing.
Mhm. Reverse engineering crashed UFOs.
That too. Yeah.
Gary, this has been so wonderful. I know we could go and talk for days and days and days, but I won't keep you anymore for your Saturday. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to put in the description your website, your book, your upcoming book. Can people pre-purchase the book yet or no? Not yet.
Not yet, but if you want to send me an email at Genesis 6 Conspiracy, that's the number 6, Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2, but the number 2 at gmail.com. I will send you a notification as to when the book is going to be officially released, and what that price will be and where it's and how you can purchase it. So
Right.
all of
Okay,
that
I'll put that
information
info in
isn't
the-
yet
in
firmed up,
the
but I'll give you a
description too.
notification when I get that information. And I'll send
Wonderful.
you a picture of the cover.
Perfect. Thank you so very much. And I wish you all the best as you finish your book, and I look forward to reading it. And maybe have you back on again. That would be great to talk about it.
Terrific. It's been fun.
Thanks so much, Gary. Take good care. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Ursula Bielski. And until next time, remember to pray for ghosts. Take care.
Thanks for listening to This Present Darkness. The video version of this podcast is available on Ursula Bielski's World of the Supernatural YouTube channel. Be sure to become a subscriber by signing up with Buzzsprout today. And remember to sign up for the World of the Supernatural mailing list at worldofthesupernatural.com for our monthly newsletter and more. And don't forget to support the podcast through Patreon.